Hello, my name's Nathan Ward from the Big Story Trust, and earlier I caught up with a personal friend and mentor, Toby Travis. So Toby, thank you for taking the time out to catch up with me. For people that don't know much about you, tell me a little bit about yourself and your background in gospel magic.
Well, first I would clarify by saying I probably wasn't a gospel magician in the sense that I basically did one gospel magic trick in my career, maybe two. But was I a working illusionist magician who utilized a magic show as a form of ministry? Yeah, absolutely. Um, so my beginnings, I was working as a young magician way back in my early teens. In fact, I was a protege of a gentleman by the name of Bob Thrasher. And Bob had been a vaudeville performer in the 1920s, 1930s. He was an IBM gold medalist back in, I think, 1934. In fact, if you go back and look at the records, I mean, it was astounding. I think he won 3 or 4 gold medals in that year. I mean, he was an amazingly talented man, and I was very fortunate to be mentored by him. But Bob was not a Christian magician. He basically introduced me to doing shows for Rotary clubs and the Kiwanis and the Masons and the Lions clubs and the Boy Scouts blue and gold dinners. And then that turned into, club dates as I got a little bit older and that sort of thing. But during my teen years, I came to Christ through the ministry of Youth for Christ, a teen-focused ministry, and then in my young adult life, I ended up on staff with Youth for Christ. And at that time, I was still doing magic on the side, but I had not connected the two. So I was working in Christian ministry, but it hadn't even really dawned on me that I could put those two. Magic was a way that that's kind of how I made ends meet. That's how I bought groceries and because I was in ministry, and so income was very, very little from the ministry. But then, long story short version, a friend of mine introduced me to who Andre Cole is. And in fact, Andre had been on the cover of Genie magazine. So this would have been, late 70s. So maybe even 1980-ish, kind of in that era. And that was the first I'd really even known of Andre. And I read this article with amazement. It's like, well, look at what this guy's doing. And of course, Andre had been out there since '64. How I had missed him, I don't know. But he just had not been on my radar, or my world was just too small or something. And I reached out to Andre's office at that time because Andre was producing, or attempting to produce at least, seasonal shows, holiday shows in different cities. Where he wouldn't necessarily be the performer, he was producing these shows. And so there was some kind of casting calls that went out. And so we had some correspondence there. I didn't end up doing those shows. In fact, I don't think he ended up producing it quite the way that he had originally planned either. But that was my introduction to Andre Cole. And a correspondence began and continued on over the years. And I began then really just through the inspiration of that Genie article. I mean, it wasn't even through any act of mentoring. I'm like, okay, what does this look like? And so I started doing some youth events. I was working for Youth for Christ, so it made sense, and started throwing some magic into it. Going along with this, I was actually a vocalist. I was a singer.
And still are.
Well, to a certain extent. And so about 1985, released a solo album. And I thought that was the trajectory of my life. Magic was always fun. It was a great hobby, and it was a kind of a part-time business. But it didn't really define me until the year I toured as a soloist, as a singer. This was early contemporary Christian. In fact, it's hard to even label it that, but it was more like pop folk, modern Christian music. And I would go out, and as part of the tour, my tour manager encouraged me, said, your magic thing is really fun. People like to see that. Why don't you put a bit of that in the show or in the concert? And I said, well, sure, why not? And it's kind of how I got started performing in front of an audience, was through the magic shows when I was a kid. So in between the songs, I took about a 10-minute set. Yeah. And I don't even remember the routines that I did now. It was probably 20th Century Silks or something, but I did just a little bit of magic. And, well, Nathan, after the concert, all people would talk about was the magic.
Wow.
And I'm like, and I sold a few records, but it wasn't like that was just, skyrocketing. And then I thought I got what was kind of a big break. There's a large Christian radio network in the States called the Northwestern Radio Network, 500 and some stations, coast to coast. And they were giving me, it was half an hour, maybe it was a full hour even. I think it was half an hour. But they were basically launching the album for me, coast to coast. And so it was a live broadcast. I would come in and, they would do cuts from the album and they interview me between the songs. Well, about 10 minutes into the interview, they asked the question, so how did you get started performing? And I said, well, actually, as a magician, I was trained as a young magician when I was in my early teens. And well, that fascinated them. Well, out of that half-hour interview, I bet we talked about magic for 20 minutes.
Wow.
And I remember thinking after that interview, I'm in the wrong business. I'm barking up the wrong tree. Singers are a dime a dozen. And people are really interested and fascinated. And at that time, there weren't a lot of Christian magicians, and in fact, you had Andre. and there were a few others out there, but not really, going at it. So, and I'm making a long story out of this, but I was on staff with Youth for Christ. No. I'm mixing myself up. I was actually an assistant pastor at a church at that time. And, but I knew that was not the long-term fit for me. I was in the pastorate just long enough to realize that's not where I should have been. And church politics and all of that, I was not a good candidate for. And so I wanted to go back to work for Christ. And I remember I was on the phone with my regional director, and I asked him about the idea of, I was doing these shows on the side, and by the way, over those years, I was getting more and more requests to do ministry shows. And so I was in that point of, okay, do I do this full time or not? It wasn't quite enough to do it full time. And so when I talked to Youth for Christ, well, could I pursue this, as a full-time endeavor as a ministry under YFC's banner? And they said, well, what does Andre Cole think of this? Because he'd been doing this for, decades with Campus Crusade. And so I connected with Andre, and he invited me, as he does and had so many others, well, come on the road with me. And you'll talk to, I'm sure even in this program, you'll talk to probably half a dozen guys who've had this part that's similar to their story. They spent at least a year or more on the road with Andre Cole. And Andre was just so gracious. And so I was on the road with Andre, and while on the road with him, also building a business model and designing an illusion show to be launched the following year under the banner of Youth for Christ. And this was not competitive. It was fully, congenial and supportive. In fact, he even helped me secure a number of the first illusions we had on that first road show. We purchased them together. In fact, he used some of the equipment, took it to an international tour, and then it transferred to my show after the international tour. And so it was through, that year of mentoring by Andre that I was learning the ins and outs of, okay, how do you do this as a full-time ministry? And then it was, let's see, this would be summer of 88. I think it was,
Mm.
that we launched the first Illusion and Beyond show,
Wow.
and we were hauling, I think it was, what was it, 6 tons of equipment, and we had recruited a staff, and it was awful, Nathan. The first year, well, it was certainly the first 6 months. Remember, in the years that followed, just as good therapy, we would pull out videos of the first tour and just cry until we were laughing so bad because it was so awful. But it got better and better.
How did it get better?
Well, constant critique, was one of the lessons. Andre, as I'm sure you know, worked very, very closely with David Copperfield.
Mm.
And I've met David, but I can't say that I really, know him well. But one of the things that I learned from him is this idea of continual critique. He would have, and probably still does, he would videotape every performance and then watch it afterwards and do that. And so we would do that as often as possible, just stick a camera in and it wasn't pretty photography, but it was, okay, video doesn't lie. And so I would force myself, even though it was very painful, to tape it, watch it, tear it apart. Also, I would rely on those whom I trusted in the business to frequently sit in the audience and just, give me notes. And so that idea of just being constantly open to critique. One of our dear mutual friends who's with Jesus, Pete McCann, when Pete and I became very, very good friends, that was part of the relationship. Is I loved working with Pete because he had no trouble telling me what I was doing that was terrible.
Oh no, I've had the same.
And again, would make me laugh and cry about it, but he was, almost always right, and he would feed the same off of me. So for a number of years there, we toured together. I would tour with him there in the UK. He would, come over and tour here with me in the States. But beyond just the joy of working together, though, it was iron sharpens iron. And if you can build relationships like that with professionals whom you trust, that's enormously valuable. There were a number of years there, especially in the 90s, where I was actually working as a show consultant for a number of folks. I developed some graphs that we could use, what I called show graphing. And but being able to look and assess someone else's show, you can't help but reflect on your own.
Yeah.
So I could say, yeah, they were paying me to come and critique their show, but and as an educator, I see this all the time. Now as an educator, I go out and I assess and evaluate schools for accreditation. Well, I love those opportunities because I learn how to do my school so much better when I'm watching and critiquing other schools. Well, the same thing was true in those years of running the show. As it got better and better because I was willing to hold it with an open hand. I'm not a magician. I love magic. I love performing. I love the ministry of it. But I also knew I'm not Andre Cole. I'm not David Copperfield. And much of really, I think the best years that we toured that show, it was really more of a variety show. I was so blessed with guys like Don Bursell, Michael Rudolph, Nick Sharp. These guys would tour in the show, and they would wear 2 hats. They'd be road manager and guest performer. My daughters danced in the show for a number of years. My daughter is a ballet instructor, and so she would choreograph these beautiful numbers in the show. And so the illusions were the feature, but having the comedian open and the mime featured and then the comic and all of that just made it a wonderful experience. And I didn't feel like it all had to be about me. And it just, but it was my show.
Oh yeah.
So it was like, I'm writing the checks and we're building this thing. But the more open-handed I was with the show and let others be creative, Kevin Ridgway, who still tours. In fact, they just came through a terrible bad accident and have recovered from that and are now on the road. wonderful, wonderful talent, and came in and helped me with what intelligent lighting, was the new thing,
Yeah.
and we were adapting that to the show. I really gave him kind of free license to come in and just, what do I need,
Mm.
and that was great. So
Excellent.
that was a long answer to your short question, but I
No.
think what made it better was all the people I was able to connect with and share ownership, if you will, of that final product.
Yeah, just picking up on a couple of points there, Toby. The first one, how important do you think it was for you to have two magical mentors, one in the early days and then Andre later on?
Yeah, huge, huge. In fact, I had a very brief conversation with Doug Henning years
Mm.
ago, and he was making the point that no, he didn't know a single professional. I mean, he didn't know anyone working full time performing that had not been mentored.
Mm.
So yeah, magic books are great. The magic videos are great, but there is almost a necessity, because you know what it is. I mean, it's an apprenticeship.
Mm.
It's an apprenticeship art. I can remember as a boy when I was working with Bob Thrasher. Now he was the classic magician. So he was in tuxedo and tails, um, beautiful white hair.
Yeah.
Well, maybe if I could let it grow. And he was physically fit, but I can remember in his living room spending hours just learning how to bow.
Mm.
So how to recognize an audience, how to make eye contact, all those little nuances. And then we would spend lots of times on routining and pacing a show. So it wasn't, yes, there was learning magic tricks, and we would do that. And he had, elements of that where he would just say, you don't have to be good at a lot of things. You got to be great at a few things.
Mm.
And you need to be able to do it until you don't have to think about doing it. It happens. So having that accountability and that guidance. Yeah, as a young boy, as a teenager, I was a very busy magician, and I think part of that was because I was this kid
Mm.
who wore tails and had that. Of course, I was
Finesse.
a lot lighter.
Yeah.
I had curly blonde hair back then, but but there was, I was mirroring my mentor, obviously, and but that what I'm trying to express here is that commitment to excellence.
Mm.
I don't think I could have been pushed to that level without the accountability and the mentoring of Bob Thrasher. And then certainly the years that followed, and then when I was producing and trucking the big show, there's no way I could have done the things we did on that scale without the vision and the guidance and the feedback from the likes of Andre Cole and others, by the
Yeah.
way, that also I was blessed to have connection with.
And how did you move, Toby, from being kind of the protege of Bob to Toby? Because I see a lot of people that have got mentors and they end up as clones, if that makes sense.
Sure, sure. I think we all start there. In fact, I mean, I wouldn't let them out. But if you watched, the early videos of the Illusion and Beyond show that I first produced for Youth for Christ, I mean, yeah, I was a blonde-headed Andre Cole. I mean, you could almost hear, Andre's. Now, some of that was very intentional because I wanted to make sure, he had a formula that I thought, okay, this is working. And so, in fact, as we scripted the show, I got Andre's approval on every line of the script. So it was nothing that, he didn't know I wasn't doing, but especially like in the gospel presentation, I mean, so much of it was almost word for word what he had done. I think that's, I don't know, but there certainly was in both of those mentoring relationships where, yeah, it was get comfortable. Well, now I'm trying to think back. Um, oh, who was the real influence on it? But this was somewhere along the line. I sat in on I don't know if it was a training or a conference where it was a marketing. Now, okay, it's coming back. It was a marketing conference that had talked about your most valuable asset is you.
Mm.
because nobody can market you.
Mm.
So that really struck me. It's like, okay, in fact, and then I would teach this actually in later seminars when I would do conferences. You would look at you could look at like Copperfield. In the early days, there might be some magical representation in his posters, and if you watch his advertising over there, that goes away, and then
Mm.
it's all David. And so it's that same principle. So I'm like, okay, so if the unique thing that I'm selling is not magic, it's Toby, then I did spend intentional time thinking, okay, so what is that character? What is this Toby Travis person on stage? And because I was doing my desire was ministry, was because I wanted to build credibility in order to be able to share the most personal thing in your life. I'm like, okay, so I've got to build kind of a boy next door image that by the time I get to the gospel presentation, you trust this guy.
Mm.
And that was very, very intentional. So then, we looked at material, we looked at costuming, we looked at the music, the lighting, everything that would be focused around that. I mean, there were some great things, some great magic that I thought, wow, that's really, really cool. That I had to say, yeah, but almost talking in the third person, but Toby Travis wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Because that's going to disconnect from our really intent, our purpose of what we're trying to accomplish here. So I would never do anything overtly gross or violent. No, I could let a comedian do that in my show. And you still get the laugh and the excitement and energy. But me, I had to be, again, the guy they trust. And so that's something I've stuck with, throughout both my entertainment career, ministry career, and an educational career.
And the trusted leader, school leaders now.
Yes, exactly. But it is the essential in leadership.
Excellent. Yeah. We started by talking about Andre Cole and how he set off to produce a show that didn't end up the way he first envisaged it. You started off being a singer, but ended up in the way it didn't envisage. As a performer, sometimes it's really hard to let go of that initial idea, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And what advice would you give to folk around that? The ability to let go, because actually you get a better product at the end sometimes.
I think self-awareness, and what I mean by that is you have to trust others, and you also have to be self-aware that you don't know everything. You're not the end. You can have a passion. I don't know if you've read Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. It's probably the best business book that's been written in the last 20, 30 years. But he talks about the level 5 leader is marked by 2 characteristics: humility, passion. So it's somebody who can be, okay, I don't have to make every decision. I don't have to be the know-it-all, but I am passionate towards a goal. And I think, that would be my encouragement to others: is be humble, allow others to speak into, what you're doing. And it can be painful, because you may have sweat, blood, and tears and invested resources. But we get blindsided. We cannot see ourselves clearly. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. And trust others, but still stay passionate. Well, this is what, character development is so important for magicians. And this is where so many amateurs get waylaid, is because, they're almost schizophrenic. They like this routine, and they like this routine, and they like that routine, and they throw it together and they have a show. It doesn't work that way. You have to build foundationally. Again, who is the character you're trying to portray? What's the story you're trying to tell? And that doesn't necessarily have to be scripted every word, but you've got to be very clear about what you're crafting, and then make decisions based on that, not based on, I saw so-and-so did this, and that's fantastic. Well, yeah, it probably was, but I don't know, is that a Nathan Ward image? Is that, you got to ask yourself that question, and you got to allow others to answer it for you too.
And you say that you don't have to script every word, but you're a big fan of scripting every word,
Yeah,
aren't you?
yeah. Well, and part of that may be because I lack a skill set in ad libbing. I know individuals who ad lib a lot, but I would say it's a skill set. For me, I get a greater level of confidence if yeah, I know what I'm going to say.
Mm.
It's and I think that's true of most performers. That if you say, "Wow," when they're on stage, like this guy's got it, or this gal, wow, she just has all this if confidence. If you ask them afterwards, was that scripted, or how many times have you done that
Mm.
routine? Yeah. I was so blessed, Nathan, in the years that I was performing. Really, that career was really built around 10 routines.
Yeah.
you know, um, I don't know how the local magicians do it. I'm amazed. Where they're doing the same
Same.
audiences like the school show performers. It's like, wow, a David Ginn. I don't know how he does this. Constantly coming up with material. Now I had to deal with the opposite problem, which is constantly moving. And that has challenges too. But I was able to really hone in and focus in on these 10 or 12 routines. And that was really it. I remember Jonathan Pendragon years ago talking about how he and Charlotte had built a career on 3 tricks.
Mm.
And it's true. If you're willing to do, the itinerant lifestyle,
Yeah.
excellence can be pursued and a career can be built on just a few things done well.
And picking up on the itinerant lifestyle, Toby, you've been around and watching magicians for a good few years, and so have I to an extent. And I've seen over the time quite a few magicians go off the rails in many ways in their Christian faith. What advice would you have to people to be itinerant but be safe with it?
Well, it's one of the reasons why I'm not itinerant anymore, Nathan. I lost a marriage over it, and I'm not unique. Is the set reality there? It's all too common. The nature of life on the road, it almost sets you up for failure. I mean, you're tired. You lack accountability in so many cases. So how to avoid that and do it well? I would do it in short stints. There were times I would go out on 9-week tours. I would never counsel anyone to do that, if at all possible, to avoid that. You can't step in and out of relationships like that. I mean, you just can't. Travel as a family. I've seen some very successful, and I know there's challenges there too. Years ago, I was in a training session for evangelists that the Billy Graham organization sponsored. And I remember being in that training session. It was such an honor. It was like a roundtable conference for 3 days together. And there were 30 of us from around the world that had been brought in by Billy Graham on his expense, by the way. I never got to meet Mr. Graham, but he sponsored evangelists to come in and do this. And in that roundtable, in that training, we were talking about this very issue. And Robert Coleman, I don't know if you remember, am I saying it? Or is it Robert Richard? He wrote Master Plan of Evangelism. His book was very, very popular back 20, 30 years ago. But he gave us a challenge that he never makes a trip, never accepts a speaking engagement, never goes out on a mission project unless he's taking someone with him that he's discipling or that he's building. And he was saying part of the key of protecting your own heart and spiritual maturity is constantly discipling someone else. And it's like a good principle of teaching. The teacher always learns more than the students. But there's something that ups your game. It's like, okay, if I'm mentoring someone else, and I attempted that as much as could for years. It's financially challenging, at times. But even today, if I'm invited out to, go speak at a school or go do an evaluation or a consult or a training, I'm taking along a vice principal with me from my school, or my admissions director, or someone we can do and experience it together. And but it also does build in that accountability piece. So don't isolate. Don't go out for excessive periods of time. And as much as possible, just maintain constant communication with home.
Excellent.
Or otherwise, they figure out how to do life without you. And
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you ever so much, Toby, for sharing that. And I think that's wise advice for many people. But also, thank you very much for taking the time out today to share your wisdom over the years. And also, personally, thank you for mentoring me, even though you're hundreds of miles away.
My joy, my pleasure.